Over to you, Mary. Fantastic, and that is my cue. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Why They Leave and Why They Return, Understanding Terrorist Disengagement, Reengagement, and Reintegration, sponsored by the Matthew B. Ridgway Center for International Security Studies, the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, or GISPIA, the University Center for International Studies. All three of these institutes are located at the University of Pittsburgh. And we're also delighted to be co-sponsoring today's event with the Collaboratory Against Hate, a joint counter-extremism research and action initiative between Pitt and our partners at Carnegie Mellon University. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to join us. I think you're in for a treat. This Zoom webinar, as you can see on your screen, is being recorded. My name is Michael Kenny, and I am the Wesley W. Posvar Chair in International Security Studies and the Director of the Matthew B. Ridgway Center for International Security Studies here at GISPIA at Pitt. I'm also your host for today's research presentation and discussion with Dr. Mary Beth Altier, who you can see on your screen. Now, before I introduce Professor Altier, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Liliana Devia. Liliana hails from Bogota, Colombia. She completed her master's degree in public and international affairs here at GISPIA, and she is currently a PhD candidate, also here at GISPIA. Ms. Devia conducts research on the activities of violent non-state actors in Latin America and the Caribbean. And Liliana's doctoral research focuses on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, commonly referred to by its acronym of DDR, in Colombia. So you can see why I was excited to connect Liliana and Mary Beth in today's event. Liliana has interviewed former combatants from the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, the Autodefensas, as well as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, often called by its Spanish acronym, the FARC. In her fieldwork, Liliana explores how the social identification of former fighters contributes to their decision to disengage from these armed groups. Let me now introduce our speaker. Dr. Mary Beth Altier is a clinical associate professor at New York University's Center for Global Affairs, where she also directs the master's degree concentration in transnational security and initiative on emerging threats. Dr. Altier has over 10 years experience researching the disengagement and reintegration of violent extremists. She has compiled and analyzed large-scale data sets on violent extremist disengagement and re-engagement, and conducted in-depth interviews with violent extremists representing a range of ideologies. Her other research focuses on the social basis of support for political violence in armed parties in particular, in both developed and developing democracies. Dr. Altier's research has been published in a number of peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Peace Research, Security Studies, Terrorism and Political Violence, and Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. She also serves on the editorial boards of several terrorism journals, and she is a member of the Resolve Network's Research Advisory Council and Avert Research Network. Dr. Altier received her PhD and master's in politics from Princeton University and has BAs in mathematics and history from Drew University. She will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. Liliana has graciously agreed to help me moderate the discussion. When the time comes, please put your questions in the Q&A utility, not the chat. We need the questions in the Q&A. That's where we're going to draw on them. So Dr. Mary Beth Altier, welcome to the Ridgway Center.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kenny. I'm delighted to be here, and big thanks to you and the Ridgway Center for inviting me. I'm going to try and share my screen here. Right. Can everyone see the slides okay? All right, so today what I thought I would do is just to present some highlights from my research over the last 10 or so years. So what I'm going to do is focus on high-level findings. So I'm not going to go into the nuances of all the methods and some of the granularity of the findings. So if you have specific questions about those, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A or to share papers with you or to follow up via email. So in the first part of my talk, I'm going to discuss terrorist disengagement. So by terrorist disengagement, we're talking about why individuals choose to leave terrorism behind. And I thought it'd be helpful to just start with some excerpts from interviews that I've done with former violent extremists, because I think they highlight quite nicely some of the key findings of this research, and certainly some of the biases that I had when I began researching this topic. So the first quotation is from a former nationalist separatist terrorist that I interviewed, and he was discussing with me the point in which he was arrested. So he had been captured and arrested. He had been, for terrorism charges. And so he says, when I was arrested, when the police were trying to interrogate me, they didn't realize that my mind went into this cool zone of intense relief. Because as I was sitting there, my mind was thinking, my God, I've survived, I've been captured. I never expected to. People often don't realize that the terrorists they've captured may have been looking for a way out. And so at least when I started studying this, we tend to think of violent extremists as deeply committed individuals, right? They're individuals who would engage in violence on behalf of a cause. And what I found a lot in my research in these interviews was that many of them are actually deeply disillusioned with their involvement. And this doesn't mean that they're not committed to the cause, right? Some of them may not be, but many of them are. They're just no longer want to carry on their terrorist role. And so another quotation, this is from a former actually provisional IRA member, and he's describing here to me how what would happen is they would be transferred to Belfast monthly to a room. So this is the 1980s. So they were in a room, presumably with no surveillance, and it would be him and other provisional IRA prisoners. And at the top of the room, there was a glass dome. And so what they would do is every time they were transferred to this room, they would stand on each other's shoulders, and one of them had a nail file, and they would try and file the screws off this glass dome so they could get the dome off and then escape. And so one day they actually get this dome off the top of the building. And so you can see here, he says, the last screw came out and we were faced with the prospect of getting up through there, through this glass dome. I was the guy on whose shoulders one guy was standing undoing the screws. But, those of us who were there looked into our hearts and said, do we want to go out this skylight and return to provisional IRA? And, we didn't go out the window. And so here you have a case of, terrorists in prison who are able to escape, and instead they choose to remain disengaged in prison rather than return to the terrorist group. And again, these individuals were not committed to the cause, right? They believed deeply in the cause, but they didn't want to go back to the life, that involved their involvement in terrorism. It was a very difficult lifestyle for them. And so I think that these quotations highlight nicely the difference between what we call disengagement and de-radicalization. So when we're talking about disengagement, we're talking about the process of ceasing one's involvement in terrorist behavior. So this is a behavioral change. So whether one is a propagandist or financier or engaged in intelligence collection or violent operative, right? We're talking about them giving up that behavioral support for the violent extremist group or cause. De-radicalization, on the other hand, is an attitudinal change, right? That's when someone gives up the violent extremist ideology underlying that terrorist behavior. And so we can have individuals like these fellows in the holding cell who choose to remain disengaged, but have not necessarily de-radicalized. And we also have individuals who may de-radicalize, but not disengage because they're trapped in the terrorist group for some reason. They don't have alternatives or other avenues available to them. So when I began studying terrorist disengagement back in 2011, and I should mention a lot of what I'm going to present, at least at the first part of my presentation, this research was conducted in conjunction with Dr. John Horgan, Dr. Emma Leonard-Boyle, and Dr. Christian Thorogood. And some of it was sponsored by the UK government and the US Department of Homeland Security. And so, as I came to this topic out of graduate school, fresh out of graduate school. And when I looked at the literature on terrorist disengagement, what I found was that most of it was based on interviews with small samples of terrorists, typically, though not always, from the same terrorist group. And so what scholars had done at that point in time is they've conducted these really great, rich, in-depth interviews, and they would record why people said they left terrorism behind. And so we had this list, basically a laundry list of why people left terrorism behind. And Torrey Bjorga was the first. He categorized these into push and pull factors. So push factors are things about your involvement in terrorism, right, that you don't like, that push you away. So things like disillusionment with the strategy or actions of the group, not getting along with the leaders or other members, difficulty adapting to a clandestine lifestyle, the inability to cope with the physiological and psychological effects of carrying out violence. So just as an example here, I once interviewed a provisional IRA bomb maker who had no problem planting a bomb. You could take a bomb, plant it, kill people, no problem. But the terrorist group asked him to go shoot someone point blank, and he absolutely couldn't do it. He said he couldn't look someone in the face and do that. Loss of faith in the ideology. So there we're talking about de-radicalization and burnout. Pull factors, on the other hand, are things outside of the terrorist group or movement that lure someone to a more conventional social role. So things like positive interactions with moderates, employment or educational demands or opportunities, the desire to marry and have a family, the demands of having a family. I think anyone who has a family knows that there are a lot of demands there, the promise of amnesty and financial incentives. So, this list, when I looked at it, this was really useful, but I thought, well, this doesn't explain why some people experience these push or pull factors and leave, and then other people experience the same exact things and don't leave. It also doesn't tell us why some individuals experience these things at one point in time and don't leave, but then experience them later and do leave. And it also tells us nothing about prevalence. So if I'm a government practitioner and I want to try and draw people out of violent extremism, where can I get the most bang for my buck, right? Which of these factors explain disengagement decisions more frequently? So what my colleagues and I started to do is we looked at the literature, different literatures that we thought could help us understand this phenomenon better. And so we consulted the literature on desistance and recidivism from criminology, on voluntary role exit and disaffiliation from new religious movements from sociology, on commitment, so why one remains committed to a particular relationship or social role from social psychology, and then the literature on workplace turnover from industrial and organizational psychology. And that literature is actually really interesting because it discusses withdrawal behaviors, so things that you might see when an individual is starting to disengage. So there are some behaviors that would translate to a terrorist organization. So I'm happy to talk about those in the Q&A, really interesting stuff there. So I can't cover everything that we found in that literature review. It's in the Journal of Peace Research in a 2014 paper called Turning Away from Terrorism. But one thing that we found that I think is really, really useful when thinking about terrorist disengagement is Rusbult's investment model from social psychology. And so this is developed by Carol Rusbult and her colleagues. And what they theorize is that one's commitment to a particular social role or organization is a function of three factors. The first is the satisfaction they get from involvement. The second are the investments or the sunk costs that they've made. And the third are the alternatives available to them. So this model is useful for a number of reasons. The first is that it has a very robust empirical evidence base. So when we study terrorism, it's very hard to get random samples. We have a small base rate, but this has been tested across a range of social roles and relationships. So there is this robust evidence base for it. It also helps us understand why some people experience push-pull factors and don't leave terrorism behind, right? Maybe they have high investments or sunk costs. So I often tell students, right, if a neo-Nazi gets a SWAT sticker on their face, that's a huge sunk cost, right? It might be hard to go out and get a job after that. It also helps us understand why some people are more committed at certain points in time and not others. So again, and the last thing actually I will say is that it also helps us understand, if we look at that satisfaction component, we know that individuals' involvement in terrorism is driven by different things, right? So for some individuals, they're deeply committed to the ideology. For others, it might be financial gain. For others, it's the social bonds or the friendships that they're getting. So this satisfaction component helps us understand, if we take into account what it is that motivates an individual's satisfaction, we can understand why different push factors matter for some individuals and not others. So if my involvement is driven by social bonds and I'm not getting along with members, that may be more important than if my motivation for being involved is ideological and I'm not getting along with other members. So after going through related literature, we had this question of prevalence, right? Which of these push-pull factors are more prevalent in the terrorist population? And so what we did is we sought to move beyond those small samples of interviews and to really look at a broad range of terrorists. And so what we did is we used autobiographies that were authored by individuals involved or formerly involved in terrorist activity. Our initial sample yielded over 100 books published between 1912 and 2011. We had to remove some of them. There were clear discrepancies in some of the accounts. Some of them don't discuss their involvement in terrorism. So Jerry Adams, for instance, denies he's in the provisional IRA. So our final sample, we had 85 terrorists representing over 70 groups. And what we did in our data set is we code that by the engagement event. So we're interested in why people disengage, and they may engage and disengage multiple times over their life course, and the reasons for their disengagement may vary across those observations. So we're left with 185 engagement events. And in 170 of those cases, the individual disengaged. In some cases, they remain engaged, like when the book ends, for instance. So one of the first things we looked at is just how do terrorists leave? How do they disengage? And what we found in our sample is that in exactly 50% or half of cases in our sample, the disengagement was individual and involuntary. So what does that mean? These are cases where an individual's disengagement comes about typically because of imprisonment. We had 1 or 2 cases where an individual's passport was seized by their father, or they had hurt their leg and they couldn't engage in terrorism. In about 29% of cases, the individual chose to walk away from the group. So those are the cases we're most interested in. Why does an individual choose to walk away from terrorism? In 14% of cases, the individual's disengagement was part of a collective voluntary process. So they disengaged because, for instance, their group chose to lay down its arms. So we're talking about groups like the ANC or the Provisional IRA. And then in 7% of cases, their terrorist cell or group had been basically defeated, and that's why they chose to disengage. So when we look at prevalence, what we did is we coded whether or not the individual said that a particular push or pull factor played a role in their disengagement. So you can see here, we coded whether or not they said it played any role. And then we also looked at whether or not they said it played a large role, meaning it was the primary driver of their disengagement, or whether it played a small role, meaning it contributed to their disengagement, but wasn't the primary driver. And so these are self-reports, right? Why they explain why they disengage. And what you can see here is that for the push factors, they are pretty prevalent. So the disillusionment with strategy or actions of the group, with leaders, with members, with their day-to-day tasks, meaning their role, right? So maybe they, go to join ISIS because they want to be a fighter, and ISIS tells them they have to peel potatoes or something like that. Importantly, we found loss of faith in the ideology or de-radicalization only played a large role in 16% of our cases of disengagement. And this is important because I think a lot of times practitioners think you need to de-radicalize individuals to get them to disengage. But we found, that for some that was a prominent reason, but for most, it actually was not a prevalent driver of disengagement. So you can see those there. Interestingly, when we looked at the pull factors, they were much less prevalent, right? So you can see the percentages here. They still mattered for some individuals, so it's not to say that they don't matter, but they were much less frequently cited as driving individuals' disengagement decisions. Now, this isn't altogether surprising. The more we thought about it, we thought, well, if you're deeply ideologically committed, then, offering someone, educational opportunities or maybe the demands of having a family, that's not enough to pull someone out of the group. And so what we did is we broke the data down looking at the level of ideological commitment of the individual at their time of their disengagement. And what we found is that for individuals who are not at all ideologically committed, that pull factor, right, those pull factors, having those opportunities available to them outside of the group, and this is very consistent with some of Dr. Kenny's work with Dr. Julie Chernoff-Wang. What we found is that those are much more prevalent in explaining disengagement decisions, but then as the individual becomes more and more ideologically committed, they are much less prevalent in explaining disengagement decisions. What we also did is we realized that there could be some hindsight bias or just incentives to misrepresent why one disengaged. So what we also did is we coded whether or not an individual experienced a push-pull factor during their engagement. Because again, they may be biased in sort of how they're describing events. So we said, all right, well, let's just code whether or not they were said during their engagement period that they were experiencing burnout, disillusionment with members, regardless of whether or not they report it as contributing to their disengagement. And then what we did is we took the group of individuals who voluntarily disengaged and used a quasi-control group of the individuals who involuntarily disengaged under the premise those individuals would remain involved. And what we found was very similar. So we found that the push factors increased the probability of voluntary disengagement, and the pull factors did not have statistically significant effects. And again, we think that this relationship is being moderated by ideology with the pull factors. Another interesting finding here I just want to mention, because it's very consistent with some of Dr. Blee's recent work, is that we found that women, if you look at some of the numbers here, women were less likely to disengage voluntarily. In some of her recent research, she finds that women have fewer alternatives outside of terrorism and more sunk costs. So I think that dovetails nicely with her work. So another thing we looked at when it came to disengagement were roles. So what was coming up in a lot of the interviews that I was doing was that individuals' roles sometimes really played an important part in their disengagement. And by roles, I mean the jobs that they held in the group and how that connected to other roles in their lives. And so one way in which we found that roles mattered was that oftentimes an individual's role would contribute to what we call role strain. So role strain happens if you're put in a role that you're not particularly well suited for or don't enjoy. So I think we've all had an experience where someone gives you a job and it's just not matched to your personality or your talents or your abilities, right? So these are individuals who, like, for instance, if you have someone who's like an extrovert, right? And you put them in intelligence collection and they're living underground, right? That's could cause some role strain. So this is an excerpt from the autobiography by Alki Collins, and he's discussing his role strain. You can see here, he says, I hadn't come all the way from America to sit and watch other mujahideen train and fight in Tajikistan. I tried to get a straight answer out of them, the leaders, about when they would send me to fight in Tajikistan. They didn't conceal their anger either and told me to hit the road if I didn't like the way things were going. I should have apologized to the commanders and continued to stick it out in the camp, but I was young and hot-headed and told them goodbye. And so he details in his book time and time again about how he wants to be on the front lines. He doesn't like the role that he's in, and he leaves different groups actually multiple times. Another way that roles matter for the disengagement process is that there are often conflicts between one's violent extremist role and the other roles that they hold. So either as a parent, in terms of their employment, and this can cause friction and lead to disengagement. So this is an interview I did with a former Islamist extremist, and you can see she says here, the more intrusive they became in my life, I thought, okay, I need to stop putting up barriers and boundaries. And by they, she means the terrorist group. Whether that was physically at home, I stopped them from coming to my home because it was overtaking my home. It was overtaking my family as well. So dropping my kids off and having to go to events and organizing events, that was stressful. Trying to hold down a job, a normal day job. It's a very schizo situation because you're having to be normal, yet you're working for a cause. And then finally, the other way that we found that roles mattered was that individuals in certain roles we were finding seemed to have more sunk costs and fewer alternatives. And that's a generalization, but just generally we were finding that individuals in certain roles had these higher costs and fewer alternatives. And you can see that coming through in this interview with a former far-right terrorist here. So he tells me, I think it all depends how valuable they were to the organization. Then it would be easier to leave or just drift away or not be involved. So it wasn't that difficult. So I suppose it all depends on your seniority in the organization and what you know about the organization. If you're in a crucial position, say you're somebody who's in charge of weapons, that's not somebody who's going to walk out of the organization, you know. And so what we did is we tried to test some of these things statistically using that autobiographical sample. And so what we found was that role strain definitely increased the likelihood of voluntary disengagement from terrorism. We also found that role conflict increased the likelihood of voluntary disengagement from terrorism. And then what we also did is we looked at whether individuals in leadership or violent roles, because that was what was coming through in our interviews, whether they were less likely to disengage than those in support roles. And so what we did is we controlled for role conflict, role strain here in all of our control variables. And we also controlled for the level of ideological commitment. Now, why is this important? This is really important because we typically might think that leaders and violent operatives are more ideologically committed. And so that's what's explaining, you know, why they don't leave versus others. So we do control for that. And what we do find is that leaders and those in violent roles are generally less likely to voluntarily disengage, and those in support and logistical roles are more likely. And we think that this has to do with the fact that they have higher sunk costs and fewer alternatives available to them given their role. Now, the last thing that we looked at when it comes to roles is whether or not individuals in certain roles were more likely to experience different push-pull factors. Now, this is important for intervention. So if you think about whether you're going, when you're going to intervene with someone, if you can have some sense of what push-pull factors they might be experiencing, then you can help kind of tailor your intervention. And it's not surprising because individuals' roles in these organizations are very different. They're doing very different tasks, right? So they're more likely to experience different things. And so what we found was that leaders were more likely to experience disillusionment with members, difficulty living a clandestine lifestyle, regret for their role in attacks, and more likely to have ties to non-extremist individuals. Violent operatives were more likely to be experiencing physiological distress and burnout, and those in support roles were less likely to be experiencing some of these factors, especially difficulty living a clandestine lifestyle, difficulty coping with attacks, and regret for their role in attacks. All right, so I'm going to shift gears now to the second part of my talk and talk about terrorist re-engagement and reintegration. So that is why once someone has disengaged, what explains why they might go back to their involvement in violent extremism, and how can we best support their reintegration into society? So when we talk about terrorist re-engagement, that's distinct from recidivism. So re-engagement, when I refer to re-engagement, I mean a return to terrorist activity with or without formal sanction. So re-engagement would include individuals who have left violent extremism behind, but are not necessarily on law enforcement's radar. And this happens all the time. You have individuals involved who just leave, right? And then maybe they go back. Recidivism, on the other hand, is a return to terrorist activity after some sort of formal sanction. So these are individuals who are typically picked up by law enforcement, arrested, convicted, and then re-engage and are typically arrested and convicted again. So recidivism, when we talk about terrorist recidivism, that is a smaller subset of terrorist re-engagement. So there's been a lot written very recently. You can see the dates on these. These are all pretty recent studies on terrorist recidivism rates. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this here, but I just want to highlight that the rates of terrorist recidivism in recent research are very, very low for developed democracies. You can see the countries we're looking at here. Again, mostly developed democracies, very low rates of terrorist recidivism. The one exception is Hassisi and colleagues' study of Israeli security prisoners. So there we see a 60% recidivism rate. It is important to note that's a slightly more active conflict zone. And then the other thing to note is on the right side here is that these studies are all using different measures to measure recidivism. So some of them are using rearrest, some of them are using reinvolvement, some of them are using reconviction. And so this brings me to some of the measurement issues that come up when we're looking at terrorist recidivism, right? So one is, what is it, right? Is it that the person becomes re-involved after they're released from prison? Is it that they're rearrested? Or is it that they're reconvicted? And so the bad news here is that criminologists can't even agree on this when they're saying criminal recidivism. But it's really important because criminologists have shown over their lengthy history, right, of literature that using different definitions and measurements here actually leads to very different results in terms of rates and risk factors. So one thing that I would say in terms of our study of terrorist recidivism is that we need to either get on the same page or come up with some benchmarks around measurement so that we can compare things more comparably. The other complications with measuring terrorist recidivism is that it does require, and even re-engagement, it does require a lengthy time horizon, right? So just because someone has not gone back to terrorism today doesn't mean that they're not going to go back in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. They're definitely more likely to go back, closer to the release, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to. And so some of the data that I've looked at breaking that down, you can actually see that if we go back further, those recidivism rates are a little bit higher. The other issue with some of the recent studies is that we don't know the effect of surveillance and security measures. So a lot of terrorist offenders are subject to strict surveillance measures today. So for instance, you can't use the internet. You can't leave certain parts of London in the UK. You have to check in every so often. And so I would imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine that that could inhibit someone from re-engaging, even though they have that intent to. And so one question is, when those measures come off, right, how likely then is the individual to re-engage? So we don't know the effect of those measures. And then finally, I think, there has been a lot of focus on terrorist recidivism rates, But I do think there's an even deeper theoretical interest in understanding re-engagement. So again, that's that broader category. Now, why is this? Two reasons. One is that recidivism rates miss people who are not reconvicted typically or rearrested. So just as an example, if we think about Usman Khan, the London Bridge attacker, so he definitely, he participated in programming, he definitely re-engaged, but he would not be captured by most recidivism statistics because he died in the commission of his attack. So I think when it comes to terrorism, we do have this really strong theoretical interest in understanding re-engagement. Second, I also think we can learn a lot by studying the re-engagement of those individuals who are not on law enforcement's radar, right? So understanding why they choose to go back or not. So what do we do, to try and better understand terrorist re-engagement is, again, we consulted our autobiographical sample, and in collecting it, we coded for a number of things related to re-engagement. Now, the autobiographies, when it comes to re-engagement, offer several advantages. The first is that they circumvent to a certain extent that time horizon issue. So not all of them, but most of them cover these individuals' life course to a great extent. So we are getting around that time horizon a little bit. They also offer self-report data on involvement. So criminologists studying recidivism say that self-report data is the best data you can get because individuals may re-engage, right, or re-offend in the context of criminology, but they're not rearrested or reconvicted, right? They're not on law enforcement's radar. So if we really want to understand this process, we need to know when they always go back. And then finally, the autobiographies offer variables that are not captured by crime statistics. So if you're looking at offender data, you typically don't have measures on level of ideological commitment, usually ties to individuals in the terrorist group, those sorts of things. So the autobiographies let us collect those measures, which are not typically available in offender data. Now, there are a couple disadvantages to using the autobiographies. The first is that they do tend to overrepresent those with a long history of involvement in terrorism. So if you are picked up on a material support charge and your involvement's 1 or 2 months, you're not likely to write an autobiography about that. So again, these may be individuals whose involvement is a little bit lengthier. And the historical sample is likely not subject to the same surveillance that we see today. Not to say that there's no surveillance, but not the same level of surveillance. So what do we find in our analysis? So these are the re-engagement rates we find in our sample, looking at disengagement rates and then seeing whether or not the individual re-engaged. And so these percentages are quite high. They're more in line with the CC study and findings from criminology. But again, I would just caution that could be because they are overrepresenting those with a longer history of involvement. What's important to note, however, are the differences across the different types of disengagement. So when individuals voluntarily disengaged, right, we have a 58% re-engagement rate. When they're coming out of prison, slightly higher, 68%. And then when the group chooses to disengage, we see that the re-engagement rate goes down quite significantly. And that is because, one, they may not have a group to return to, but also because their grievances may be channeled through a political process. The other thing that we looked at in terms of re-engagement are risk factors. And so what we did there to draw up some hypotheses is we looked at the criminal context. So what explains recidivism in criminology? And so in criminology, they divide risk factors for recidivism into 2 categories. So the first are static risk factors, and these are things that are not amenable to intervention. And so what criminology finds is that age, right, is a static risk factor for recidivism, with younger individuals more likely to reoffend. A history of deviant family members or peers is also a risk factor. And then one's social class of origin, with those coming from lower social classes more likely to reoffend. Now, what's really interesting are the dynamic risk factors. So these are things that we can change with interventions. And so the most robust dynamic risk factors in criminal recidivism are antisocial attitudes, antisocial associates, and a lack of social achievements. So lack of social achievements are things like marriage, education, employment. And so if we kind of map this onto the terrorist context, in terms of antisocial attitudes, we're talking about radicalization, right? Are they radicalized? In terms of antisocial associates, we're talking about whether or not they're still retaining ties to individuals involved in violent extremism. So we can map these quite nicely onto the terrorism context. So what do we find in our autobiographical sample? We find, our findings are very, very consistent with criminology. So we find that the likelihood of re-engagement for terrorists declines precipitously with age, so peaking a little bit before age 30, you can see there. And then we also find that ideological commitments and connections to individuals still involved in terrorism are two risk factors for re-engagement, two of the most prominent in our sample. And this maps really nicely onto the literature from criminology in terms of that antisocial attitudes and antisocial associates. We also find that coming from a lower childhood family socioeconomic status is likely to increase the likelihood of re-engagement. And we think that has to do with the alternatives and the alternatives available to individuals outside the terrorist group. The other thing I want to highlight here is if you look at this graph on the left, is that these findings are very similar, independent of the way in which the individual disengaged. So you can see down here, we're controlling for the way in which they disengaged, and the effect on the probability of re-engaging, these lines are relatively flat, is almost the same. Now, the one area in which our findings diverge from the literature on criminology is that we find no evidence that one's employment status or their marital or parental status affects the likelihood of re-engagement. And that's very different than the findings from criminology in terms of social achievements. Now, why do we think this is the case? So if we think about terrorists and how they differ from criminals, terrorists, right, many of them are ideologically committed. And so what we're looking at here, because we're controlling for ideological commitment, what we're saying is that, if someone's ideologically committed and they're employed or they're a parent or those sorts of things, that in the short term, that's not going to affect their likelihood of re-engagement. However, I think these things are very, very important in the long term. So it's not to say that they're not important. And so why are they important in the long term? They're important because they shape those other things that we're controlling for, right? So having a normal job, being married to a pro-social individual, being a parent, those sorts of things over time, research shows can shape your attitudes, right? So to develop more pro-social attitudes, and they can also shape your associations, right? So if you have alternative associations outside of your involvement in violent extremism, over time, those things can have an effect on those other factors that we find matter. All right. Now, the development of pro-social attitudes and a pro-social identity, which is so important for deterring re-engagement, often I find in my research is a very long-term process, right? So we're talking about de-radicalization to a certain extent. So this is a former Islamist extremist I interviewed, and she's talking about her disengagement and de-radicalization. And she says, the process is now you've come out. You're still carrying the narratives. Where do you get that tackled? Where do you find the alternative? It's probably taken me 10 years, right? So again, this isn't a quick process. She detailed to me how she would go online and read the Quran and how, she would question things that a certain sheikh had told her. I've also interviewed a neo-Nazi who would tell me how long it took him to look at a bagel and eat a bagel and not think horrible things about Jews. So this process of constantly challenging those beliefs can often be a long-term process that, again, can be shaped by those individuals around you. So pro-social ties and pro-social identity are really, really important in fostering reintegration. So one of the barriers for individuals coming out of violent extremism in terms of developing those pro-social attitudes, ties, et cetera, is that there's often a stigma around them. And so why is there a stigma around violent extremist offenders when compared to other offenders? And so there are three reasons I hypothesize. This is a recent paper in Terrorism and Political Violence. So one, the literature on criminology says that people are more likely to support rehabilitative measures if they believe that people are redeemable, that is, they can change. And so I think with violent extremists, people often think that ideological commitment makes them less redeemable, that is, they're less likely to change. There's also this outsized fear associated with terrorism. I think many of you know, right, the fear and the threat of terrorism is inflated, especially in developed democracies. And then terrorists also threaten not only your personal safety, but also the political system. So these are three reasons why there may be a stigma around terrorists. And so what I did is I sought to seek whether or not there actually is this stigma when it comes to rehabilitation programs. And so I ran a survey experiment and I looked at whether or not individuals in the US would support a prisoner reentry program. And what I did is I varied the offender. So in the first, I have a criminal, Matthew Jones, convicted of conspiracy to support murder, conspiracy to commit murder in support of racketeering. Then in the second scenario, I had Matthew Jones convicted of conspiracy to commit murder in support of a white nationalist terrorist group. Then in the third scenario, I had Mohammed Khan convicted of conspiracy to commit murder in support of an Islamist group. And then in the final one, I varied the age of the offender. So I have Mohammed Khan convicted, but he's a juvenile and now he's convicted of material support. And so I find strong evidence of a stigma when it comes to terrorist offenders. So first, what I find is that support for rehabilitation programming for a criminal offender in the US, based on my survey, is about 79%. So that's really high, and it's in line with what we see in the criminology literature. However, when that person is a violent extremist offender, it drops to 58%. Varying the race of that violent extremist offender from a white nationalist to an Islamist further drops support from 58% to 47%. So there's a significant racial bias there. But then in terms of varying the age of the offender and the offense, what I find is that support for the Islamist offender who's younger and convicted of a lesser charge, support then rises from 47% to 57%. So an Islamist juvenile offender convicted of material support for his reentry programming is about the same as a white nationalist offender convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. So how do we combat this stigma, right? So if we want to support the reintegration of these individuals, how do we combat this stigma around them in society? So in a recent Resolve Network report, I reviewed the literature on DDR, which Dr. Kenny mentioned at the beginning of the intros. And I say, well, what can we learn from this literature? It doesn't only look at how to combat stigma, but that's what I'm going to focus on here. And so a couple of things that I find is that there is this problem of indefinite and inhumane detention. So if we think about the ISIS camps, for instance, so research from DDR shows that holding individuals in indefinite and inhumane detention not only increases the stigma around them, but also makes it harder for those individuals to see themselves in a pro-social role or to see alternatives outside of their involvement in violent extremism, right? So this contributes to stigma and makes it harder for them to reintegrate. Research from DDR shows that certain community-based projects that are locally owned and in which not only the perpetrators are benefiting, that those can help reduce stigma and foster these pro-social ties. Some research from Burundi shows that public sensitization measures can be very effective. So explaining to the population why reintegration is important, also explaining that some individuals are coerced or that children, for instance, are victims, that can be very effective in fostering acceptance. Also the careful framing of government NGO policies, programming and participants, that can be really helpful. And I think we need a lot more research here. How do these programs frame these offenders? How are they described? And how does that affect community acceptance of them? Some of the one study I mentioned that I did in terrorism and political violence, I also find that individuals are more likely to support rehabilitation if there's evidence that programming actually works, right? So we can prove its effectiveness. And then I'm actually doing some work right now with Gordon Club, and what we're finding is that just mentioning that an individual participated in a rehabilitation programming, regardless of whether or not that programming is shown to be effective, just saying that they actually participated in the program, that increases not only support for the individual's reentry, but also willingness to engage with them. So things like willingness to invite them over, for tea, those sorts of things, which is really important in fostering those pro-social ties. All right, so just to wrap up, in terms of future research, if there are any graduate students on the line here, these are some of the things that I'm thinking about where I think we need more research. So in terms of recidivism and re-engagement rates, and I talk a little bit about this in this terrorism and political violence paper, I think we need to know much more about terrorism laws and how they affect the rates that we're seeing, right? So in some places you have material support charges. So these individuals are not deeply involved in certain cases in these organizations, right? That's very different than having a group where individuals are deeply committed and involved. So terrorism laws vary, so it becomes very difficult to compare these recidivism rates. Prison sentences also vary. So in the US, we have very lengthy prison sentences. So when these individuals are coming out, they're presumably much older and less likely to re-engage. And we don't know how that affects things. Some individuals are operating in conflict zones. Some are operating in non-conflict zones. How does that affect re-engagement rates? Some individuals are operating where there's a low level of development and there aren't economic opportunities outside violent extremism. And some individuals are operating where state capacity is low, right? So again, they may fear for their security and there are other things going on. So again, I think comparing recidivism rates, we need to think about how these things are affecting that. And then related to that, I think in terms of disengagement and re-engagement, we need more focus on how structural and individual level variables are interacting. So a lot of the research on terrorist disengagement and re-engagement does focus on the individual. So I'm often asked by practitioners, what sorts of programming would be effective? How do we evaluate how effective this program is? And they're not looking at the structural factors around people, right? So again, where state capacity is low, where there's conflict going on, where there's insecurity, I often say, well, your program could be effective, but it's a revolving door, right? So you're getting people that come in the program's effective, they go out, but then 10 more people are being radicalized by these structural conditions. So your program's just, you have this revolving door situation. So I do think we need much more attention to how structural factors shape the disengagement and re-engagement process. And that's some of the things that I do look at in that Resolve Network report on DDR. So those are some of the studies that I mentioned today. And I thank you so much for your time and look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary Beth, for that detailed, insightful, and provocative, presentation. Clearly, you're a leading researcher in this area, and we've just got so much to learn from you. So thank you for that. Just a quick clarification question: the results of that survey experiment that you were presenting your slides on, which paper is that from?
Yeah, so it's called Criminal or Terrorist. It's in Terrorism and Political Violence.
Okay, all right, here we go. This one, Criminal or Terrorist, Fear, Bias, and Public Support for Prisoner Reentry Programs.
Yep.
All right, so that's a terrorism and political violence paper. Oh, and that's a new one. Okay, excellent, thank you. I want to turn it over to my colleague, Liliana Devia, who's going to help me moderate. And Liliana, do you want to open up the questioning for our guest?
Actually, I was going to ask Mary Beth a question. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very enlightening. I think that there's a greater understanding of why individuals disengage, and it is likely contingent upon a deeper comprehension of how they disengage. I know that your work has been helping us better understand this. I see that your more recent work in terms of re-engagement and reintegration is helping us understand this, in the sense that when we include re-engagement, we kind of evaluate disengagement, in the sense that on one end we will find engagement, on the other disengagement, but some of these people go back, and in that sense, their going back would be a failed disengagement.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would like you to answer to me is, how can we deal with that ideological component that we know that is a risk factor here, when we know that some individuals are more ideologically driven when we talk about violent terrorism? So we know that this in the long term is a risk factor. We have identified this, and the causes and the grievances seem to continue to be there, even though they are trying to leave their group behind or terrorism behind. So what can you say about it?
So in terms of ideology as a risk factor?
Yes.
So in terms of how to shape that in terms of to support their reintegration, is that?
I feel, in the sense of this will continue to be an obstacle for their disengagement. So how can we manage that ideology as a risk factor if we're trying to keep them from re-engagement?
Yeah, so again, that's like the silver bullet question there, right? I get asked that a lot. So I think, again, it's as I mentioned, it's a very, in my experience from talking to people, for most, it's a very slow process, right? And so I think, again, making sure that they have the networks around them that over time will help them challenge those ideologies is very important, right? So again, fostering, so things like those community-based projects can be very helpful. And this is why I'm so concerned with stigma, right? Because if there's stigma around them, then they're never interacting with pro-social individuals. They're probably will rely more on their antisocial associates, right? Individuals still involved in violent extremism. And so again, like just supporting the networks around them that can help them over time challenge those beliefs. And again, I'm not a firm believer that the government can do that, right? It has to, it's from what I've seen, it's a very slow, organic process. And a lot of times it is driven by disillusionment, right? And it's not necessarily disillusionment with the ideology. So again, just thinking about an individual I interviewed, deeply disillusioned with hypocrisy on the part of the leader of the group, right? Saying that, you can't do this, but then he's doing that, right? So disillusioned, then starts kind of questioning what the leader is telling him, her, looking online for information. And again, it wasn't like an overnight switch in terms of the ideology, but enough of disillusionment to disengage. And then over time, she's able to build a support network around her that helps her challenge those beliefs. So part of it is a willingness to want to challenge those beliefs, I think, for some people. But over time, I think just having that network, having those alternatives can help that process. I think a lot of times practitioners think that that's a really quick process. Like you sit down, you talk to someone, a couple of times and it's over in 6 months. But I think from what I've seen, that's a very long-term process. And I think where practitioners can help is building that network so that when programming is taken away, that network is there. What I see with most programming is there's not enough resources to have that, for 10 years, right? So you need to build the network and the alternatives and things like that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, thank you.
So networks in and networks out.
Yeah.
As you know, has been widely studied in the literature. The second, the role of social networks in facilitating disengagement, and even in some cases, de-radicalization, is also significant, important. You're recognizing it in your work. Julie and I talk about that a bit in our political psychology paper. So I think that's a great point. We have some wonderful questions on the board that I'd like to turn to. So I'll pull the first question that I'd like to ask. And I'm not necessarily going in order, kind of mixing going in order, plus trying to keep it coherent. I would actually like to start with Joshua Krasna's question. Joshua asks, if the extremism is socially accepted or admired in their milieu or even their society, does that reduce the possibility of de-radicalization? Can they stay in their surroundings after leaving?
Yeah, so thank you, Josh, for the question. That's a really difficult question. I didn't have time to talk about it today, but one of the findings coming out of that literature review is what we call the importance of normative commitment, which I often think is overlooked in the context of violent extremism. So that is the belief, right? You're committed to a group, not even necessarily because you like the group or you have high sunk costs and few alternatives, but because you feel that you have a duty to belong to that group based on your socialization. So I often think about, like if I was born in Gaza, right, I might be socialized in a particular way that I feel like I have a duty to participate in Hamas, right? And maybe I don't even like Hamas, and maybe I don't have high sunk costs or alternatives, but I was socialized in a way that is my duty. So I do think it's very difficult when you have a radical milieu around the individual, and there are reasons why you might try to reintegrate the individual in a different area, but that can also be destabilizing. So when you're talking about reintegration, when you're talking about disengagement, that's a very destabilizing process. I didn't talk about it in my talk, but people describe it as a vacuum-like experience. You could think about it if you quit your job, right? Or if you leave your partner, that's a very, destabilizing vacuum-like experience. And so I think sometimes, again, putting them in a whole different area can also be a little bit destabilizing. But I absolutely agree with you that if they're not able to establish what we would call pro-social relationships, and pro-social in and of itself is a difficult term, but by pro-social, I just mean like, we're radical milieu. I will say one of the things that I think has been effective in radical milieus is channeling those grievances, if possible, in nonviolent ways. So just saying like, I understand that you have grievances about what Assad is doing in Syria, but going there and fighting is not the answer. Maybe there are other ways in which you can express or protest or do other things. So I do think that's one way that could be potentially effective.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary Beth. And thank you, Joshua, for the question. Liliana, do you have a question from the Q&A you want to?
Yes, in fact, I was thinking that we should answer Deborah Smith's question because she woke up at 4 a.m. to attend this presentation. So she would like to know if it's practical pretty much to identify re-engagement, like what happens in the initial engagement and what happens in the re-engagement, what like for behavioral indicators. Do you think those things are different? Those things that drove them initially, those things that get them back into the group?
Yeah, so I think, I think it's important to note that it's not always the same thing. So the thing that initially sparked their engagement may not be the thing that sparks their re-engagement. So again, sometimes disengaging is such a vacuum-like experience, and again, if they're not able to see a way for themselves while they are disengaging, that could spark their return. But in terms of behavioral indicators, those things that I mentioned, so if you see them, starting to talk to individuals in the group again, those sorts of things, that to me would be sort of a red flag. And again, in today's day and age, that could be online, or it doesn't have to necessarily be in person. So I think that could be something in terms of those antisocial associates.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and ask a methodological question that comes from Christopher Lemery. I believe you mentioned that you removed some of the autobiographies from the data set because they weren't reliable. What other sources and methods did you use to check the reliability of the autobiographies in your sample?
Question. So again, I mentioned we did remove ones where there were a couple cases where there were very clear and documented discrepancies between individuals' accounts and what happened. So we did try to verify, just sort of the basic information about the individual's involvement in these groups. We also did interviews. So I did interviews with some of the individuals in the sample. So that was really helpful in confirming what was in the account, or maybe a lot of times there were things that were not in the account. So that's sort of the best that we could do. We also did, as I mentioned, we did try as much as possible to control for hindsight bias. So again, even if they didn't say certain things played a role, we would code for those things, in their experiences, just to see if they were associated with things like disengagement or re-engagement. Because again, I think there is that hindsight bias, and there is that incentive to misrepresent, one's involvement.
Could you speak
sometimes.
more to your interviews, Mary Beth? Would just love to hear a little more about, about how that went for you, how you access these people, how you were able to sit down with them. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm guessing our audience would like to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, so definitely, I think the interviews I learned, and Dr. Kenny, from your own research, I learned so much from the interviews in terms of, understanding. I think it's Liliana mentioned how, right? How does this process happen? And that's sort of one of the questions we ask, is just not, why did you disengage, but how did you? Like, can you take me through that process and what it looked like? In terms of identifying participants, yeah, that was an interesting process, I will say. But again, when you sit down with these people, they're just, one of the things that I guess was surprising to me starting out like 10 or so years ago is they're just people, they're very ordinary people. I had one fellow who he was like 20 minutes late, and I was like, oh my gosh, this guy's not going to show. And I'd flown all the way far away to interview him. And then he shows up like decked to the nines with like a purple tie. And he's like, I didn't know what to wear. I was so nervous. Realizing that they are ordinary people. Obviously, they've done horrible things, but they are to some extent shaped by their, their environment and their experiences.
Thank you so much for sharing those
yeah.
insights. Absolutely fascinating, Mary Beth. I'll go ahead and pull another question from our list. I'm going to ask Anonymous's question. He's asking, or he or she is asking, has there been research on terrorists who are in supermax prisons? Should one attempt to rehabilitate them? Do they want to be helped? Do they even have such programs there in a supermax prison?
Yeah, so I haven't done any work in supermax prisons. It's very hard to get access. I know some people have, but it's very hard in the US to get access to these offenders in prison, especially given the ethical considerations around interviewing them. But what I will say, and again, going back to sort of the initial quotations that I had, is that I don't think, anyone, we shouldn't assume, right, because they've done horrible things or they're in a supermax prison that they're happy with what they've done. So I've interviewed a lot of people and, they'll spew the ideology a lot of times. But then what you realize is they're just deeply disillusioned with their involvement and they just want a way out of it and they can't see a way out of it, right? So they're assuming that role, they're, spewing all the ideology and whatnot. But when you dig down deeply, not all, but many of them are really looking for a way out. And again, if they don't have alternatives, they'll dig in and they'll seem like they are deeply committed. To interview a woman in a far right extremist group in the US. She had a ton of tattoos and everything. And she would say, like, when we interviewed her, it actually came out interviewing that she got the tattoos because she wanted to show her commitment to the group, really believe in to show that I'm committed to the ideology. Because if I'm not, they'll kick me out of the group, right? So it's a way of expressing their commitment to the group or whatever they're getting satisfaction from out of their involvement, or maybe they don't believe they have alternatives.
Excellent point about the role of friendship there, sometimes trumping other influences, including ideology. Thank you for reminding us of that. Liliana, do you want to ask the next question?
Yes, it's a question by Mohammed Eladl. Is there a relation between the literacy level and probability of re-engagement?
So yeah, so again, we are in our data set, we're coding these from autobiographies. So we don't know their literacy level. We know their educational level roughly, and we do control for that. And we don't find effects. So I can't answer the question about literacy, but in terms of education, we don't find effects there.
Okay, let me move on to Elizabeth Meyer's question. Have you studied similarities between modern day criminal offenders and the escalation in Ireland during the Troubles of the 1970s to the 90s? I'm a graduate student studying Irish history, and I was curious if you have evaluated European incidents as deeply as this era.
Yeah, so I've done, in my other work, I've done a lot of work on Northern Ireland, actually. So I'm working on a book project looking at why people vote for armed parties, and a lot of that research does draw on Northern Ireland. So I haven't looked at criminal offenders versus individuals involved in the Troubles. I will say, though, that some of the individuals that I've interviewed, I mean, in terms of, so you mentioned the 1970s to 1990s. So particularly in the 1970s and 1990s, I would say for many people that involvement was driven by political circumstances, not criminal circumstances, and that these individuals were deeply ideologically committed. So I did interview one individual who told me, he witnessed Bloody Sunday, and he had always been he'd always been a Republican, but he wasn't violent. He wasn't in the IRA. And he said after Bloody Sunday, he said, if I could be killed for doing nothing, I might as well be killed for doing something, right? And so that repression had a significant effect on his willingness to engage in violence. Now, I will say in terms of Ireland today, that involvement is definitely a much more, there's definitely a much more criminal elements there, given the peace process. So the individuals who are involved in those groups today are, much more likely to be similar to criminal offenders. I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Yeah, I think it is. Thank you. We have a couple of questions now, recognizing that the focus of your research was not on, January 6th, the Capitol insurrection, and what we're currently struggling with here. Although there are some far right memoirs in your larger sample, we do have a couple of questions. Asking about that. So in research, but any thoughts that you might have, for example, question from Tammy Palacios. She thanks you, Mary Beth, for an amazing presentation. And she goes on to ask you, do you have any thoughts on how de-radicalization from domestic extremism seen en masse in the US should be supported? Assuming it could be more difficult for some, considering de-radicalization when it isn't the exotic others, but it's us. If the answer does not lie with the federal government, do you believe the answer may lie in our community structures and education systems?
Yeah, so again, I haven't done interviews with anyone from the January 6th insurrection, but I'm obviously something I'm following closely. In terms of what's going on in the US, I think it's very scary. Again, having studied Northern Ireland for a long time, I see a lot of parallels over the last few years in the US with things that happened there. In terms of de-radicalization of those individuals, I think it's important to point out that these ideologies often appeal to people because they're trying to make sense of a personal crisis or a societal crisis. So I think in the US, we have a clear, we've kind of come to a head and we're having a clear discussion or I don't know what the word is, arguments or something about race, right? And so I think a lot of people in the US are worried, white people, about losing their privileged status. And so what we're seeing is that they are, again, buying into some of these ideologies for that reason. Some of them, again, things like, I'm unemployed, right? That could be a personal crisis. And then what they do is the ideology helps them make sense of that, right? So maybe I'm not unemployed because I didn't show up to work 300 times, but it's because there's this immigrant caravan coming around, right? So I think that we need to deal with those factors, and some of the things that you mentioned in terms of education, focusing on mental health, I think is a huge issue. And then I would also mention foreign influence. The foreign influence component of what we saw on January 6th is huge. So, talking about state actors like Russia, fueling polarization in the US, we also have we need to deal with algorithms and what they're doing. So I think there are a lot of moving parts to what we saw on January 6th in terms of de-radicalization. But again, I think it is symptomatic of these larger structural changes. So whenever we see democratization and the inclusion of groups and upward social mobility, we see this in Northern Ireland, right? Things kind of come to a head, and certain groups do become violent.
Thank you. Yeah, Liliana, go ahead. Thank you.
I would like to refer to the question by Kyle Moody. He would like to know about Roosevelt's investment model. I know that you went over the literature from psychology, social psychology, sociology, and criminology, but he's particularly interested in understanding if these, like what drove you to this is the mathematical approach on basically what is the input, to say it, in terms of the psychology of the individual, pretty much, that you're studying.
Yeah, so the model itself is from social psychology, so it's not a purely mathematical model. And what I will say, I didn't have time to discuss in the presentation, is that scholars are working on now is looking at the weighting of those different factors, right? So the way that they are in the model, they're kind of all equally weighted. But what researchers are finding now in social psychology is that satisfaction component is more heavily weighted. So there is some work going on now looking at the psychology of that and how the satisfaction component may have a little more components. So again, thinking about disillusionment and those things in terms of driving the disengagement process.
Excellent, thank you. Liliana, I'm not seeing any more questions on the Q&A. Is there anything we haven't asked our guest that we want to make sure we ask her before we go?
Well, I can keep asking questions. I think that even though there was one question raised in terms of prisoners of maximum security, I would like to know what is your experience in terms of understanding the disengagement process of someone who is in
Yes,
prison?
that's a great question. So prison, for some it can be, there's a lot of talk about prison radicalization. So for some that can be, particularly radicalizing moments, right? It can make further radicalized individuals. But I think what I've seen in, some of my research is that prison is actually a very helpful time for people. This is a great question. Because it provides them separation from the group and separation from their roles. So you can imagine if you're a violent extremist, particularly if you're living underground, you're busy, you're working, it's a very stressful situation. You may be disillusioned, but you may not have time to process that disillusionment. So a lot of times having separation from the group can give you time to think and reflect on, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? Do I enjoy doing it? Why am I not happy about this? I've interviewed one individual in the provisional IRA who actually asked, he was disillusioned with his involvement. And when he was arrested, he actually asked, he said, can I be put on a loyalist wing, which is almost like a death sentence, right? But he just wanted to be away from the group. He wanted time to think and reflect on his involvement. So I think it can be a very rehabilitative experience for people. I do think that we need to better leverage prison in terms of the reintegration process. So again, if people are in prison and during that time, they think, well, I don't have any alternatives outside my involvement in violent extremism. Prison can also create more grievances or fuel grievances. So I'm thinking about, I've interviewed individuals who have been in solitary confinement and, they talk about how that violates their human rights. And, they're very adamant about that, and that creates more grievances. So I think we need to think about how prison can be leveraged for good and to support that reintegration process.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary Beth. I have a question I'd like to ask. So you've done all this research over the last 10 years, absolutely fantastic work, and you've used a variety of methods. You've got your terrorist memoir sample, moving more in the direction of survey experience. So just bringing, using a variety of data collection and analysis strategies to inform your understanding. And you've obviously developed a very sophisticated understanding of how disengagement works. But let's say in a room of policymakers and you had to summarize, what are, 2 or 3, for a government agency and trying to facilitate disengagement or de-radicalization, or frankly, somebody working for a non-government body? What are the key takeaways that you would want people to understand in terms of how we can try and tackle this ongoing problem?
Yeah, so I think the main one is the one that I mentioned at the end of my talk and where I kind of think my work is headed, and that is that if you don't fix the societal issues, you're going to have this revolving door of violent extremists. So again, your program can be effective. I can give you things that I think might make your program effective. But at the end of the day, right, if these societal issues are not addressed, then you're going to have people that have grievances that are susceptible to radicalization. And here I'm not just talking, this is in the DDR report, I'm not just talking about, conflict zones or developing countries. I think even in developed democracies, there are issues around Muslim integration in certain areas. There are issues, in the US that I mentioned. So I think that, bolstering democracy, practicing what you preach, right? Governments not engaging in human rights abuses and things like that. I think that can have an effect, a more, sort of sustained impact than these one-off programs. And it's not to say that these one on-off programs are important. They're very important in terms of supporting people's reintegration at individual level, right? So does my program reintegrate people, but also at the societal level? So are there more violent extremists today than there were yesterday, right? And in the US, I would say absolutely yes. There are more today than there were yesterday of violent extremism. And I think that's really hard for governments to grapple with, because I think sometimes they don't want to admit that some of their policies may contribute to those things. It's not easy. It's a long-term, slower process, right? Rather than just having a program. But that's sort of the advice that I would give, is to think long-term and to think more at the societal level. What are the drivers?
Excellent, Mary Beth. Thank you. Liliana, before I wrap it up, I just want to make sure I'm not cutting you off or anything. Are we good, Liliana? Any?
Yeah, I only want to you to discuss, if possible, if we're thinking about an alternative here for controlling what's going on, like having alternative social networks to prevent re-engagement. But we know that some of these individuals were in key roles, but when they go back to society, they're just like someone else. How can we deal with that loss of status? That society, I mean, they're just going to be just another individual, and that prestige and status is lost. And how do we deal with that?
Yeah, so I've interviewed like a far-right extremist in the US who his involvement in violent extremism was motivated by power. So it's a really great question, right? It's the power I had in the group, I was a leader, these sorts of things. So again, I think there are ways to do that. And one of the findings of my research that's really interesting that I haven't written up because I don't really have, I think, enough data to support it. But one of the things that I've seen in my interviews is that people's roles and the roles that they enjoy, things about them are often very similar to the roles that they have once they leave. So if you are a leader, right? I know one individual who was very entrepreneurial, started his own like faction of a right-wing neo-Nazi group, TV, has his own company. So I think that there are ways that you can facilitate that. They need to find another sort of outlet for whatever that satisfaction is that they get from their involvement. So it could be power. I know another individual who was very like quiet. He was a bomb maker, and now he works in IT, right? So again, it's finding a role outside the group that they feel comfortable in, and that is a good alternative for them, right? And I talked about role strain. You can have role strain in the terrorist group, but also when you're disengaging, you can have role strain, right? So maybe you're a big, powerful leader in the group, but now you've come out, and now, like, I don't know, you're doing something, you're a trash collector or something, right? That's, no. So that could create role strain. So it's finding something, and it doesn't have to be like you're the leader, of a country or something, but it could be that, you're the leader of some like NGO, or you have some entrepreneurial role where you feel valued and respected.
Yeah, but I raised the question because we talked about the stigma associated to leaving terrorism and having the label of former terrorist is just not something that can make you recover the sense of leadership, or who are you going to lead with that label? Yeah. So that's kind of like why I was raising the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, so you're talking about like a leader of a whole terrorist organization or something like that? Yes, I mean, we do see those individuals, like, again, drawing my work in Northern Ireland, which I think would have some parallels to your work on Colombia. We do see those individuals sometimes leading political parties. I know in Northern Ireland, they're given community organizations. And so they do find roles, for instance, like keeping individuals out of violence, right? Keeping children out of violence. They have their own offices, community organizations, like ex-prisoner associations. So I do see sometimes individuals successfully transfer into those roles. But it's a good question, because I do think it can be this very vacuum-like experience. But I think, finding ways for them to have a sense of self-worth and alternatives is really important. And a lot of work in Colombia suggests that these community-based projects that I mentioned can be really, really effective in doing that. So if, for instance, like an NGO wanted to fund a community-based project that's locally owned, where former combatants very entrepreneurially help lead that process, that can have really positive effects on their their sense of self-worth, the alternatives they see outside the group, and then also the acceptance of them. Because what happens is the community sees that the whole community is benefiting from this reintegration, rather than giving them, like a stipend and a job that's not, just a one-off job. In that case, many times people think, well, the perpetrators are just, benefiting. Why are they benefiting, right? They did horrible things. So it is a difficult, nut to crack, but I have seen individuals who are in pretty prominent roles, find alternatives.
Thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you for the question, Liliana. While you were answering that, another question popped up that I'd like to ask you. It comes from Eric Manton, who's asking about, in terms of disengagement, from your research, how much does it matter who or what institution is carrying out the disengagement, the messenger question? In the Balkans, if ethnic Macedonians are running reintegration programs involving ethnic Albanians, would that work? Question. And how would that translate to the US situation? Anti-government January 6 insurgents being reintegrated by US government agencies, when we know many of them are fundamentally anti-government in orientation. So how can that work? Any thoughts you might have on that?
Yeah, so again, I think I mentioned earlier, I think it's very difficult for government practitioners, particularly when the individual is anti-government, to credibly do this sort of work. So it could be working with NGOs, different things like that. And it's not to say that they can't do any of this work. I do think they can do things to help promote disengagement. So again, in terms of making sure individuals have alternatives, that they're secure. I mean, like in Colombia, security is a huge issue, probably less so in the US. I do think that they can do some work, but when it comes to de-radicalizing individuals, right, again, I think that needs to be a very organic process. I don't think that the government is well poised to do that, again, given perceptions of the government and their interests. So in terms of,
I would agree with that. I've certainly seen that in my work on al-Muhajirun. I've interviewed a number of people who were the subject of de-radicalization programming at the invitation of Her Majesty's government. And the people that they send to talk to these activists from the activist perspective just have absolutely zero credibility, just zero. And so that definitely becomes an issue in terms of the effectiveness of, in this case, I'm talking more about the de-radicalization end of it. So thank you, Dr. Mary Beth Altier, for an absolutely fascinating presentation and discussion afterwards. We posted links to Mary Beth's articles on the chat. Sandy's been posting links as we went. There's a link to this new paper and also the Resolve Network report, so you can see those. I want to thank our audience, to everyone who came out today. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for your questions and your participation. I see you. I appreciate your support. I want to thank GISPIA, USIS, and the Collaboratory Against Hate for co-sponsoring today's event. A special thank you to our guest, Professor Mary Beth Altier, and my co-mod, Ms. Liliana Devia. Thank you both. And last but not least, I want to thank Ms. Sandy Monteverde, the Ridgeway Center's Assistant Director. For all social media manager, Jordan has also been helping out. So thank you to Jordan as well. Before I let you go, I want to very quickly announce a couple of upcoming events that we're hosting here at the Ridgeway Center. First, 2 weeks from today, on Wednesday, October 27th at 1:30 p.m., the Ford Institute of Human Security and the Ridgeway Center will present the inaugural lecture for this year's diversity series. This series builds off our highly successful diversity series from last year. Last year's series featured African-American scholars in world politics. Our theme this year is Latinx scholars in international affairs. So our first speaker will be in 2 weeks. It's Professor Greta Friedman Sanchez from the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And Greta is going to be talking on terrorized at home and falling through disciplinary and policy silos in armed conflict context. And she's looking specifically at Colombia. I believe we have a link to that event, which will be posted in the chat. So you can start to register even now. The second event is on Monday, November 1st. The Center for Governance and Markets here at GISPIA is coming together with the Ridgeway Center to present a policy roundtable on Afghanistan. The working title is After State Collapse, Afghanistan Following the Taliban's Return to Power. This will be an in-person panel discussion with live streaming. We're going to hold the event Union. Panels include my GISPIA colleague, Dr. Jennifer Merchishvili, a leading authority on Afghanistan, along with Dr. James Pickett, professor of history of the Persian world here at Pitt, Dr. Akram Umarov, a Fulbright scholar from Central Asia, also here at Pitt, and Dr. Idris Rahmani, an Afghan analysis based in Pittsburgh, along with yours truly. Our panel will be hosted and moderated by Haider Alhamudi, professor of law and vice dean of the University of Pittsburgh's School of Law. So we're going to be promoting that. You'll learn more about that event. So thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you, Liliana. Thank you, Sandy. We appreciate your support. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.